This works. Okay. I haven't checked. The SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice of the University of San Francisco acknowledges our presence on the unceded land of the indigenous Ohlone communities and pays our respects to these traditional caretakers and elders, past, present, and emerging. It's our intention that this acknowledgement plays a role, however small, in a much larger process of confronting the past in order to create a not yet realized future rooted in justice. Welcome everyone to the fourth event of the spring 24 semester of USF SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice. Tonight we will learn with New York City's finest, Leo Ferguson, San Francisco's Rabbi Faryn Borella, and USF's own Professor Oren Kroll-Zeldin, an event titled Anti-Zionism and Antisemitism, Compassion and Disagreement in a Time of Violence. My name's Aaron Hahn Tapper, and I direct our USF SWIG program in JSSJ. And I want to begin by thanking the JSSJ faculty and staff for their help in organizing this event, particularly Victoria Farlow. Before introducing tonight's program, I'm going to take a brief moment to tell you about our university and our extraordinary JSSJ program. Founded in 1855, USF is our city's first university. Our tagline, "Change the world from here," is legit. With a 9,000 plus undergraduate and graduate students, U.S. News and World Report says that we are the #1 most diverse campus in the country in terms of racial and ethnic makeup. An educational institution where 1/3 of our undergraduates are the first in their families to attend college. We estimate that 30% of our student body identify as queer and some 10% of our student body identify as Jewish. A premier Jesuit Catholic school in 1977, we became the first Catholic institution in the world to endow a Jewish studies program. In 2008, we became the first university of any kind, Catholic or otherwise, to have an academic program formally linking Jewish studies and social justice. In 2019, we added yet another first to our renowned history by forming a new position on campus, that of rabbi in residence. And most recently, this past fall, we launched the country's first ever graduate level certificate in JEDI and JSSJ. That's JEDI, or Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, and JSSJ, Jewish Studies and Social Justice. This graduate program gives professionals the opportunity to learn from both scholars and activists, offering a blend of academic study and real-world application. In the classroom, we offer a wide range of significant Jewish studies courses not found in other educational settings. Beyond the classroom, we offer unique events that are free and open to the public, such as tonight's event. Through JSSJ, we believe that education is the best long-term way to create systemic change. Whether one has the time to take a semester-long course or a mere few hours to hear from a single speaker, education is fundamental to making our world better, paramount in shining the spotlight on the margins, on oppressed communities who are mistreated merely because of their race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or any other social identity. The fifth and final JSSJ of this semester will take place next Thursday, April 25th, when we will have our 14th annual Social Justice Passover Seder. This year, we will focus on anti-racism, and that evening we will tell the Passover story while making connections between the ancient narrative of moving from slavery to freedom and contemporary anti-racist activism. Our Seder will take place in the McLaren complex from 6:30 to 8. I'd also like to plug the courses we're offering this summer and this fall for our graduate level certificate in JEDI and JSSJ. This summer, acclaimed educator, rabbi, and activist Julia Watts-Belser will be teaching a course titled Disability and Jewish Social Justice. Then this fall, we're offering 3 courses. The first, Binaries and Beyond, Justice, Gender, and the Future of Jewish Traditions, will be co-taught by Rabbi Camille Shira Angel and Professor Joy Layden. Second course, Race, Racism, and Jews, will be taught by Dr. Imani Chapman. And our newest course, called Meet the Moment, which will be taught by Professor Oren Kroll-Zeldin, is called Israel, Palestine, and American Jewish Life, Generational Divides and Future Directions. This course will examine American Jewish perspectives on Israel during the 20th and 21st centuries. Topics include histories of anti-Zionism and Zionism, generational trends, and particularly among American Jewish Palestine solidarity activists, Jewish responses to trauma since October 7th, ways to teach multiple narratives, and how to have hard conversations inside and outside of Jewish institutions regarding this potentially volatile topic. If you'd like to learn more about any of these events or courses, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter. There's a table right outside, and there's a QR code that can, Now on to tonight's program, Anti-Zionism and Antisemitism. As many of you know, tonight is the third of 3 events in this spring's series on anti-Semitism. The first event was titled Anti-Semitism in the Catholic Church, an Unfinished Moral Reckoning, and our keynote speaker, James Carroll, was in conversation with local Rabbi Beth Singer, moderated by USF's Professor Alexis Hare, who is an expert on genocide studies. The second event, held last month, was called White Supremacy, Anti-Semitism, and Anti-Black Racism. Our keynote speaker was Eric Ward, who was in conversation with Kohenet April Baskin, moderated by USF's Brad Onishi, an expert on white nationalism. Tonight, we will approach yet another piece of the anti-Semitism puzzle, the links between anti-Semitism and the current climate around Palestine and Israel. We'll begin tonight with a keynote speech delivered by Leo Ferguson. Immediately after his remarks, he will be in conversation with Rabbi Faryn Borella, moderated by Professor Kroll-Zeldin. I'll introduce Rabbi Faryn and Dr. Kroll-Zeldin now. Rabbi Faryn, the senior rabbi at San Francisco's Or Shalom Jewish community, has served as a Jewish educator, ritual leader, and community organizer for the past decade, working with people ages 2 to 102 to rediscover the radical liberatory roots within Jewish tradition and enact them for personal and collective liberation in our times. With an interest in the intersection of art, prayer, and social justice, Rabbi Borella has curated multimedia art shows exploring themes of Jewish liberation, taught graduate courses on Jewish liberation theology and decolonial pilgrimage, facilitated outdoor nature-based Jewish programming for kids and teens, and served as a chaplain in prisons, hospitals, and continuing care retirement communities. In addition to her work with Or Shalom, where she serves as the rabbi, she is currently a social practice fellow with LABA Bay, a Jewish arts fellowship. Professor Kroll-Zeldin is one of my 2 partners in crime on campus, along with Rabbi Angel. Kroll-Zeldin, Dr. Kroll-Zeldin, is the assistant director of JSSJ. He's the co-editor of a recent book, This Is Your Song Too, Fish and Contemporary Jewish Identity, and he's the author of a forthcoming book titled Unsettled, American Jews and the Movement for Justice in Palestine. The co-founder and lead curator of Mapping Jewish San Francisco, which is a digital humanities project of JSSJ that takes a collaborative approach to examining the history and religious, cultural, and political identity of San Francisco Bay Area's Jewish community. Oren's been teaching at USF for 11 years and has been a full-time faculty member since 2018. I can absolutely speak about Oren. I could probably give a lecture on Oren and his many gifts that he's been giving to USF for 11 years, but we'll hold that for another night. Thank you both for joining us this evening. As for our keynote speaker, Leo Ferguson is the movement building organizer for JFREJ. That's Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, one of the most important activist and Jewish communities in the country. A lifelong New Yorker with a deep commitment to social justice and a background in nonprofit communications, Leo has developed anti-oppression trainings for JFREJ, as well as leading affinity groups and caucuses exploring internalized anti-Jewish oppression, race and racism, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. He's the founder of JFREJ's Jews of Color Caucus, a lead author of Understanding Anti-Semitism. He's a graduate of the Grace Paley Organizing Fellowship, the Ben the Ark Sella Fellowship, the Join Don't Kvetch Organized Masterclass, a proud Jew of color, and a musician, and perhaps most importantly, he's a good man. Please join me in welcoming Leo Ferguson to the stage.
Thank you. Now I feel embarrassed that I know I was going to get all those things. I should say I almost walked out of here a moment ago when you first introduced me as one of New York's finest, because that's, of course, what we call the NYPD, and I spend a lot of my time organizing against the NYPD. But then you made up for it when you started talking about the social justice Seder, which takes me back to one of the very first things that I did after joining JFREJ was work on our Black Lives Matter Haggadah in 2015, I think that was, along with Coak Frazier and Yehuda Webster and Gray Hagans, and that should give you a little slice into sort of my organizing trajectory. That's a group of really incredible Black Jews. I am Black and Jewish. I grew up in New York City. I come from on the Jewish side from communist red diaper baby Jews, that tradition, like militantly secular, but very proud to be Jewish, very politicized. But despite all that, I did not think that I was going to find my political home doing work in a Jewish organization. It would not have occurred to me when I was a teenager or even in my 20s that would be the arc that my activism would take me. I was interested in things like abolishing the police and working on racial justice and things like that. And what I didn't know, and what was so special, was that I found Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. I was dragged kicking and screaming to a meeting by various people who had schemed to get me there, and I never left. And what was amazing was this is an organization that works locally in New York, and we do all of our work in New York, and we do it all in deep coalition with other organizations from other communities all around the city to fight for justice on issues that matter to New Yorkers. And it just never occurred to me that you could have a politicized Jewish identity that was rooted in a place like that. And for me, as in New York, a place that I really deeply love and care about, and the communities there that I care about, the only thing that I sort of understood politicized Judaism to be was arguing about Israel-Palestine, endlessly. And I, at that age, I wasn't interested in that, and it didn't make sense to me. And since then, a lot has changed. We've done a ton of incredible work, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But the other thing that's happened is, of course, I've come to sort of see how intimately and deeply connected issues of justice all over the world, and certainly in Palestine and Israel and in New York City are, especially when we are working in deep partnership with other communities. And so, and I'll talk more about that in a second. The way that we started working on anti-Semitism, that was not something that was a big part of our work. For we're a 30-year-old organization, more than 30 years at this point, and for a long time that was not a central focus of our work. And our prescient, brilliant executive director at the time, Dov Kent, in 2015, 2016, before Trump was even running, sort of really had this insight that there was something missing. And what was missing was that the political right really owned the conversation on anti-Semitism, that they were the only people talking about it. And for many people and many activists, there was this sense that to talk about anti-Semitism was somehow to acknowledge that it was real and it was a powerful force in the world, but somehow to play into a right-wing narrative or agenda. And so it sort of wasn't talked about. And Dov really saw that, if our movements were to be both welcoming places for Jews, but we're also going to have a really strong analysis around issues of economic justice and all kinds of things, that there needed to be a left, a strong left anti-Semitism analysis that made sense and was coherent and understood anti-Semitism within the context of all of the other oppressions that we understand, racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and all these things. And so she started doing this work, and I started doing it with her, and then suddenly we had the election of 2016, and suddenly all of this turned out to be incredibly timely and important, and we put out our guide to understanding anti-Semitism, and I started doing lots of trainings and workshops with our partners all around New York and in other places about anti-Semitism and how to understand it. And one of the things that struck me in doing this was just how profoundly confused everyone was about what anti-Semitism is, how it works, what it's for, how it operates, how it impacts Jews, where it comes from. Certainly that was true for non-Jews, but it was incredibly true for Jews as well. There's just so much confusion about anti-Semitism. There are a lot of reasons for that. Something that I'm sure we'll talk about a lot today is that one of the reasons is that there's a lot of, I just use the term, I think, motivated thinking. Motivated, there are a lot of people who have a big stake in trying to define anti-Semitism, shape the narrative around anti-Semitism. There's a lot of money that's been put into doing that. A lot of people, a lot of actors in a lot of different places who seem to have a stake in this. There's other reasons too, though. Some of it is just historical contingency. The fact that there's 2,000 years of an understanding of who Jews are and a tradition of anti-Semitism that comes out of Europe, that comes out of Christianity and Christian hegemony. And, for 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years, Jews were, certainly along with Muslims, very much at the bottom rung, the targets of intense antipathy, violence, pogroms, the Spanish Inquisition, we can go on in Europe. A place that is essentially defined by religious conflict, right? Catholics versus Protestants, everyone versus Jews and Muslims, right? That is the context that anti-Semitism comes out of in Europe. And then suddenly, Jews start emigrating to the United States, this new amazing land, this new world built on an incredible, a radical social experiment. Can we build a society based around white supremacy instead of around religious conflict, right? This is a completely different thing. And suddenly, white Ashkenazi Jews are coming over from Europe and coming to the US, and they are understood very differently in the United States over time than Jews were in Europe, right? And so it is confusing. It is a confusing place. So it shouldn't be surprising that we are also confused about, is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, when is it, how can it be, right? These are, there's no reason why we should expect people to understand this, to be conversant with. The other thing about that is just to say, Jews are a tiny proportion of the population, right? We have a lot of historical trauma, and so we are very not self-absorbed is the wrong way to say it, but we are certainly very focused on our own history, our identity, on things like anti-Semitic tropes and ideas, language, things like that. And there is a reflexive expectation that everyone else will be as well. I'm glad that it's so exciting that you showered me with seltzer. What else did you ask for than to be showered with seltzer? We're a tiny proportion of the population, and the fact that we then expect everyone else to also be conversant in these subtle nuances, all of these details. Again, Aaron and I were talking about this before. With I think about when all of the attacks against Ilhan Omar were happening in like 2018, 2017, and it was always like these tweets and these little things of language. Well, of course, the idea that someone mentions a tentacle and every Jew freezes up, and we should expect everyone to recognize that, of course, that's an anti-Semitic trope, right? Why would they, right? Why would so many people know these things? It's wonderful if people do, but there's no reason why we would expect that. And so when I started doing these trainings in 2017 for our partners, people were so hungry for this. I mean, everyone wanted, the demand, all of these non-Jewish communities that we had been working with for years wanted this information, which was really gratifying. And that speaks to both the fact that that information wasn't out there in a form that was going to be that was going to make sense to folks who were coming from a progressive tradition, but also the fact that our organization had built relationships, like really deep relationships in New York for 30 years, right? All of these communities knew us, and so there's a level of trust that existed, and that speaks so much to really, like, to me, that is the core of what it means really to fight anti-Semitism in a material way, is like we build relationships and we build them around mutual shared interest, fighting for things that matter to all of us, right? Like I said, we weren't working on anti-Semitism, we were working on, healthcare in New York City, workers' rights in New York City. We were showing up all over the place for all different communities. We were showing up for Muslim communities when they were being targeted with hate violence and police surveillance after 9/11, and they knew it, and they knew who we were, and they appreciated us for it, and that meant that they knew that we would have their backs. And then when something like the Tree of Life, happened, when horrible things were happening to Jews, we also knew that they were going to have our backs, and they absolutely did. That's what you build a really deep commitment to fighting for collective liberation around. And I'm happy to talk about more of that, but I'll just say that what's been, the thing that we talked about was that the theme for this night was going to be about compassion. And after October 7th, in many ways, the work that we have been doing at JFREJ has really all been about, in some ways, compassion, and we talk about this pretty regularly. We, even these relationships that we've had for decades were strained by this. Very shortly after, we were reaching out to everyone, and certainly reaching out very quickly to Muslim and Arab and Palestinian partners and folks that we have relationships with, and everyone was grateful that we were reaching out, and was really, that was really important that was happening. And also, people were saying, we were saying, well, we should be out in the streets right away. We should be doing things. And people were saying, our communities aren't, we love that you're asking this, but our communities aren't ready yet. There's too much hurt. There's too much pain. Since then, and that was a period of time. I'm very pleased to say that we've done many things since then together, but the way in which the level of hurt in the Jewish community, and in especially Palestinian communities, but many, all over the place, the way that all of these forces have intertwined, the lack of being conversant in the nuanced details of anti-Semitism, the amount of anger, the amount of hurt, what that can often turn into is a lack of compassion, the inability to see other people as human and worthy of our love and empathy, even when we disagree. And for us at JFREJ, the work has been, can we meet this moment with integrity, with deep integrity, without both sidesing anything, without watering down anything, but also do it demanding compassion for everyone and seeking it out and trying to cultivate it and nurture it as much as we can. So we came out very early for ceasefire, and we have been very, proud to hold to that line and do a ton of work in New York City, fighting for a ceasefire, and have been instrumental in moving many elected officials to come to that position, and worked very closely with many different partners to do it. But we are also a big tent organization. We have lots of liberal Zionists, we have anti-Zionists, we have non-Zionists, we have all kinds of different folks, and our commitment to making JFREJ a home where all of those people can come and feel welcomed is if you care about justice and you want this place, this city, to be a place that is safe for everyone in it, and that very much includes Jews, then come on down, we are the home for you. And that's not going to change. We have many people, we have people in our community who lost people on 10/7, we have, and I could go on and on. That has to be the commitment. It has to be a place where we have to be building communities and spaces where no matter what you believe, whether you could be the most ardent anti-Zionist in the world, you must still be able to see Israelis as human beings, to understand that, to understand the horror and the trauma of what happened on 10/7, and be able to hold that fact at the same time as you demand freedom and rights and safety and self-determination for Palestinians, and the same thing has to be true in the converse. And that really is the work. I mean, everything else is just the details. I'm supposed to be talking about is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, or that? So I guess I should say something about that, so you don't ask for your money back. So anti-Semitism is not, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, right? To be very, very clear, this is again something that is been politically contested I'll back up a little. For a long time, there were political actors who wanted to advance the notion that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism were synonymous. For a long time, it was very clear that those people were, if not on the fringe, certainly came from a very specific part of the Jewish community in the United States. Over the past, I think, 3 to 4 years, there has been a real push, a concerted push from much more mainstream organizations to change that analysis, to really foreground the notion that and we talk about the IHRA definition, right? These tools that people have been using to try to say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It's also very obvious in the movement, the anti-BDS free speech movement, right? So doesn't matter whether you agree with BDS or against it. We have an American tradition about free political speech. The notion that governments, that the federal government, that local governments should be passing laws that in some way penalize people who want to participate in a nonviolent boycott. These all come from a very specific tradition, and it's been so much more mainstreamed. So at JFREJ, we're very clear that that's not the case, right? That everyone should be able to criticize a government, a country, a nation, a political ideology, that is absolutely fair game. And it's weird, it's strange for me as someone who grew up in America and, post-Cold War, I don't know, whatever, modern liberal America, that would be controversial. And in most places it isn't. We can talk about the anti-CRT movement, and there's a whole nexus of folks who are working in this kind of anti-liberal, in the classical sense, sort of program, but it shouldn't be confusing that we should be able to speak out against a government and a government's policies and a political movement, a political ideology, without fear that we will be blacklisted or legally retaliated against. In fact, we should welcome it. We should be encouraging those kinds of ideas, if not about Israel, about other things, from our youth, from students, from people everywhere. Does that mean that you cannot be anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist? No, of course not. You absolutely can. And anti-Zionism can veer into anti-Semitism. Frankly, anything can veer into anti-Semitism. I'm sure we could play a weird game that would be very stimulating, terrifying for all of us, but anti-Semitism Mad Libs. But I think about, the origin of, people have heard the term Zio, right, which is this, weird, shortened version of Zionist. The origin of that term comes from David Duke. He is the person who invented that in the 1990s. I'm old enough to remember that, because he wanted to find a way to be anti-Semitic and sneak it into popular discourse without saying things about Jews. So he would just say Zionist, right? And I have heard people who don't know that history use the term thinking that they are just saying a thing neutrally about a political ideology. This is what I mean about how confusing this is. So in the spirit of compassion, what does that mean? That means that we have to, obviously there are people who show up with deep antipathy towards Jews, and we should not be confused about that when we see it, and we should call it out, and we should expect our partners and our allies from non-Jewish communities to do it. That's what collective liberation means, that we are all looking out for each other, and we should expect people to have our backs. That is a fair expectation for Jews to have. There's, at the same time, if we're showing up with compassion, we should be excited to be curious about why people are saying the things that they are saying. when, there is an incredible flattening to the idea of anti-Semitism. Is something anti-Semitic or is it not? There's just two positions on that switch, yes or no. Well, that's ridiculous. You have everything from neo-Nazis and people marching in Charlottesville with tiki torches to people tweeting some language that vaguely recalls something from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion without them ever having any idea that that's what they're doing. And if we just flatten all of that into, well, that's just anti-Semitic, and don't approach this with any curiosity, with any compassion, then we are going to alienate a lot of allies, and just make people more confused. What we should be asking is, well, what did you mean by that? When you said that thing, what were you trying to get at? Can I tell you how that made me feel? That hurt me. That made me not want to come to the next meeting that you're having, to the next, whatever the thing is. We should be firm in our self-respect and our, love and our pride in being Jewish, while also being very, humble about what it is that people know about our histories and our traditions, and we should be wanting to find ways to educate people, to let them know where we're coming from, and to work with them in solidarity. So anyway, we'll talk. I'm sure there'll be more about that. I don't want to go on and on and on. I guess I'll just leave it by saying that one of the things that clearly is going to come out of the events of the past, God, I don't know how many months it's been now, since 10 Cents, thank you, is a real, I assume is a realignment, right? Is a realignment within the Jewish community and within a bunch of different, probably, communities in the United States. And part of our job is going to be trying to, I don't know what the future is going to hold, but what we're going to have to do is make sure that however our community refashions itself, that we are making a space for a Judaism that is alive to the experiences of other people, of other kinds of people in America, in Palestine, across the world, and is integrated, is interactive, is not, as a dear friend and comrade of mine would say, it's not a fortress Judaism, but is an open and welcoming Judaism that is active in the world. If we want our traditions, our communities to go on, then they have to look good. They have to be exciting and fresh and feel like places that people want to be. And the people that I want to hang out are diverse and come from many different backgrounds. I want Black people to be in my community and to feel safe in my community. I want, people of all different racial backgrounds, of different ethnic backgrounds, of different religious traditions. That has to be an open, curious, and compassionate Judaism. And it's going to be on all of us to make sure that that's what it looks like. And I'll leave it there.
Come on up. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see such a full room. Thank you very much, Leo. I appreciate you being here, flying across this very big country of ours to be with us. I really appreciate your analysis, and as I've said to you, have admired your work from afar for quite some time. And Rabbi Faryn, thank you so much for being with us, coming from not quite so far away, at least today. And it's really wonderful to see you here. We have known each other for quite some time in a very different context. And we've come a long way from being on the ground in Israel, Palestine, doing work together, to here having this conversation in front of everyone. So I want to say two quick things to frame this and then ask you to respond to some questions. The first is that if you have questions, we're going to pass around note cards and pens or pencils. So write your questions down, and we will collect them, and we'll do questions that way, first of all. Second of all, as Leo has pointed out, this is a conversation really framed about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the context of compassion. So I really urge you, while you are sitting here actively listening to this conversation, to start with compassion. And what we're going to be trying to do here is model what a conversation looks like, and model that type of compassion and understanding, knowing that some of the things that we might say might be uncomfortable to you, or that we will be saying things that maybe are just coming up on the top of our heads and we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about it, writing it down and cultivating our words and editing them very carefully, which is a challenging thing to do. So if you want to shout out and respond, I challenge you to think about it and write down what you want to say as a question, and maybe we can get to that. And I also want to frame this and say that you are both very brave for having this public conversation in a time that is very, very challenging. Yes, indeed. Indeed. Rabbi Faryn, I want to start by asking if you can respond to what Leo has shared with us so far, just general thoughts and responses.
Sure. There was so much there. Thank you for sharing all of it. And yeah, I think there's so much there, but I think the part that stuck out to me is that this conversation has to always start with relationships, and that, we don't tackle anti-Semitism by kind of like bracing ourselves and getting really hard and being like, we won't work with anyone who ever potentially said a slightly anti-Semitic trope one time, and I'm prickly about it and I'm angry and therefore I will never work with them. But rather it starts with like building relationships with people across difference who experience their own forms of oppression that maybe I don't understand the nuances of, and we need to start with the relationships, and the relationships are what end oppression, not kind of like digging in our heels and saying that we won't partner with anyone who does so, because I feel like there's a lot of people who experience forms of oppression that I don't, who would be alone if they did so, because we all are, we all live inside of a society that is racist, and that we just, and it lives inside of us, and it's impossible for us to always speak in a way that is without any bias, and therefore we need to build the relationships, and the relationships allow us to combat all of those isms and all of those forms of oppression. And so I appreciate the work that JFREJ does at really building those relationships with authenticity, and it's not performative. It's working collaboratively and collectively to fight like battles that we all need won. So thank you for that.
For those of you who are not familiar with JFREJ, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, I highly recommend you go home and look it up. Don't take out your phone now and look it up, because you should pay attention to what we're talking about. But they really walk the walk and not just talk the talk in terms of showing up in coalition building and building broad-based social movements for justice and equality, really for all. So it is very profound work that we highly recommend you look up. Rabbi Faryn, I want to ask you another question, and then I'll ask some questions that you can both respond to. You are a rabbi in a synagogue in a community here in San Francisco. I want to know what it's been like for you to lead a synagogue in this time and to navigate the challenges internal to the Jewish community on these conversations about anti-Semitism and anti-Zion, particularly in the last 6 months.
Sure, thank you. And some of my congregants are in the room. Hi. Elliot said, "Do you want us to leave?" What's really, what's the kicker about this is not only am I a congregational rabbi in this city, but I started being one about 9 months ago. So kind of 2/3 of the journey so far has been inside of this reality, which I couldn't have ever, I guess I could have seen it coming because I've, for the past decade seen kind of bombing campaigns against Gaza about every 2 years. So I guess I could have seen this moment coming, but I don't think any of us could have seen this moment coming in the way that it has. And it's been incredibly, incredibly challenging. And that's in a variety of ways, but I think in one ways is and Oren mentioned this, we met the summer before I started rabbinical school, and I was in Jerusalem for the summer and was actually working with Sabeel Ecumenical Center, which is a Palestinian Christian liberation theology organization that wanted to write a curriculum about anti-Semitism for Palestinian civil society. And so I was partnering with Palestinians in developing a curriculum around anti-Semitism that would speak to them and make sense to them in their cultural context. And Oren and I met, I think, in some village in the South Hebron Hills or something, I believe, in the West Bank. And why was I saying that? That I have been very involved prior to being a rabbi in work in fighting for liberation for all the peoples that live in that land, and in fighting for justice for all the people that live in that land. And I think there's been the complicatedness of running an organization that I'm very blessed to say is a very left-leaning Jewish organization, and therefore I have the capacity to say and do a lot of things that colleagues of mine in congregations that aren't even that far to the right of ours can't do and say. And simultaneously, there's been a constant kind of struggle when I move through the world right now, I'm not moving through the world just as me. I'm moving through the world representing a community. Even when I say I'm not representing my community right now, it's attached to me. And so how can I show up in integrity in the way that I want to show up as myself, as a person in this moment, in kind of speaking out for what is right, while also making sure that I'm accountable to my community, which is left-leaning and yet still has a wide political spectrum similar to JFREJ that ranges from liberal Zionist to anti-Zionist. So yeah, it's definitely been a challenging time to figure out where I can just show up as me, and also how I can show up best for the community, which, I'm hearing conflicting needs from people on a daily basis that kind of contradict one another. So how can I make sure that everyone feels like their needs are getting met when they don't share the same needs necessarily?
I think many of us can relate to that in our own work. It's obviously very unique for you as a clergy member in a synagogue. I think also one of the important things to point to and to name that has been alluded to in this conversation, and I want to name, is that when we talk about the Jewish community, there is no such thing as the Jewish community. We're talking about a very, very diverse group of people with very divergent opinions and politics and ideas and beliefs. And
I believe Aaron wrote a book about it.
I believe Professor Hontapper did write a book about it, and it is assigned in many classes at this wonderful university. But I think that is a very, very significant thing in this conversation, because that holds also to Jewish relationships to the state of Israel and to the political ideology of Zionism as a contemporary political ideology, or as religious Zionism, and also historical movements of connections to the land of Israel, divorced from the state of Israel. So I'd also like to know from the both of you, in the past 6 months, how has your activism changed? How have the conversations that you've had changed, particularly in response to the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism? Leo, let's start with you.
That's a great question. So I think one thing is, it's dizzying to watch this conversation happen at the national, on this huge scale where someone like me, I think most of us in this room, right, don't have any way to just, the desire to reach out or reach into the television or onto Twitter or wherever it is and be you're wrong, or that's exactly the, it's this, it feels, I've had this conversation many times with people saying, well, it just feels like a steamroller. It feels like this force that is beyond your ability to control, because as I sort of alluded to before, the stakes are so high for folks and the interests involved are so huge. And I have to sort of constantly remind myself of the fact that our little scrappy organization in New York City can't really directly compete with very well-funded, very, very organized and intentional efforts to shape this narrative. And these come from all over the place. In particular, the really toxic relationship between the Christian Zionist right and the sort of like proto-fascist forces that have become so much more of a prevalent part of our lives in the United States and frankly globally in many, many places. And the major stake that those folks have in shaping this narrative in a very particular way, is incredibly dangerous for Jews. I mean, this is one of the things that I think, and this is the point that I so often wish that I could reach into the television and make, is to say that, and I talked about this realignment of the community. I mean, I think one of the things that's been very clear since 10/7 is, and was certainly becoming clear before it, is what an intense split there is between the Jewish diaspora and so many of the folks, certainly the political actors in Israel, and how much our interests have diverged. And one of the ways that I think that that's really obvious is around this attempt to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, because that is undoubtedly good for many political actors in Israel. There's no question. It's easy to see why that would be a useful thing to do. It's terrible for Jews in the diaspora. It makes all of us so much less safe. If it is true that to be Jewish is to be inherently Zionist, then anyone who is angry about Israel, anyone who sees the bombing of Gaza and is outraged, would be right to take it out on all of us, right? Because we are all somehow aligned with that movement, right? We are much safer if we are a rich, complex, and diverse community, and everyone knows that we are a rich, complex, and diverse community, and that Judaism is well understood to be a separate thing than one specific political ideology or the project of one nation. Because nations do bad stuff all the time, right? All nations do. So in any case, I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but just to say that that's something that I think has been especially active and something that we've certainly been thinking about and trying to call out as much as we possibly can, and to really hold that line. And maybe something we'll talk about a little bit more later, or we'll come up in the questions, is that the other thing that drives me nuts is the kind of both sides saying the left anti-Semitism versus right, and this is a narrative that makes me want to verse whatever, be very angry. And one of the reasons why, and it goes to this thing, is there is a difference between somebody saying a thing, even a very anti-Semitic thing, right? Some left leftist person could say something like that. They wouldn't be my friend, but they could say it. That is not a leftist political project. There's no left movement that has anti-Semitism as part of its political project. There is a huge right-wing movement that has anti-Semitism as a deep part of, like, this is what they are trying to build. It's part of what they are trying to build. They want a Christian nation with, anyway, I could go on. So it's like that is holding that line and drawing those things out has to be part of our work.
Yes. Yeah, and I think what you're speaking to just makes me think of, and it's like one of those things where I have to like look away and not even look that closely because I find it so terrifying. But that, you know, a lot of, I won't even say right wing, I'll say mainstream Jewish organizations that claim to be speaking on behalf of all Jews are actually putting on events that are allying with known white supremacists and who actually are quite anti-Semitic, and they share a political goal. So these kind of more mainstream Jewish organizations that claim to be liberatory for the Jews are allying with white supremacists, and therefore staking their claim saying our safety is with the white supremacists, it's not with the masses. And that's pretty terrifying to me, because the whole way white supremacist ideology functions is the Jews are useful until they're not. And so therefore, you know, it's not safe to ally with the white supremacists. Even if it is in the short term, it will never be in the long term. And so I think, I don't know, to answer the original question, I think it's been really challenging because, you know, my mandate, I was a brand new rabbi. It has not been a year at the congregation. And part of your mandate when you're in your first year at a congregation is to build relationships with all of the Jewish organizations and Jewish leaders in the new place that you're living, with all the kind of like social service agencies, like whatever. You want to build relationships with everyone so that you can be a resource to your congregants. And you're supposed to start doing so right after the high holidays. And the end of the high holidays was when October 7th happened. And it's been this confusing thing where a lot of the people I'm supposed to be building relationships with, and a lot of the organizations I'm supposed to be building relationships with, are trafficking in a lot of racism, and a lot of anti-Arab racism, and a lot of Islamophobia, are anti-ceasefire, and ardently so. And so I think kind of organizing within the Jewish world has been challenging because, of course, I want allies, and I think there's good in these people and in these organizations outside of this orientation, you know, speaking of the compassion, but it feels like an impossible time to partner with people who can stand up and claim that what is happening in Gaza right now is a rightful response. It just feels impossible. So yeah, on the one hand, it feels pretty impossible to organize within the more mainstream Jewish world right now. And then simultaneously, my positioning as a rabbi and as a more visible rabbi, as a congregational rabbi, means that I don't fully fit in on the left, I think, in the way that I used to, when I could be a little bit more inconspicuous, or when I could be more of an individual. And there are extremes that I see like comrades and allies going to that I don't feel willing to go to, partially due to just not wanting to be perceived, but partially because hearing from congregants who disagree with me has moved me and has changed me and has made me have more compassion for people who don't share my exact political orientation. And therefore, I am seeing things also on the left that make me incredibly sad. And I understand it, but I wish it was different. Yeah.
Do you think I always wonder whether my, like, being Black and Jewish, like, makes me feel more emboldened to kind of call people out when, like, they're in those spaces. I don't know whether you have any perspective on that thing, but that sort of fear around, you know, like, watching comrades and colleagues go to these extremes that are like, again, it's like about the not having compassion, right? That's what it is. It's like the I don't know. Does that question make sense, or do you think that basically, like, how does our own personal positionality play into what it's like to have those conversations?
Yeah. I think I feel much more confident in Jewish spaces with other Jews, of, multiracial Jews, kind of pointing to, like, here's where I disagree, but I find it really challenging in spaces that are not exclusively Jewish to do that work. And I think it's in part just because I just moved back to San Francisco also 9 months ago. And so while I used to live here, and so while I do have some relationships, I think being able to call out people and say, hey, actually that thing that you're doing, has an air of anti-Semitism, and I both don't like that personally, and it's not strategic to be anti-Semitic in this moment. That requires the relationship, and I feel slightly lacking in the relationships that would allow me to do that at the moment.
That totally makes sense. It makes me think about the thing of, like, especially for folks who because of all the Ashkenazi Jewish immigration to the United States, I think there's such a perception in the U.S. that all Jews are white, right? That's synonymous, and then that turns into this idea of that, like, somehow it's like vaguely punching up to be in those spaces, and like it sort of enables or makes space for a kind of carelessness that I think and like, just to be clear, right, like, I think we all do that. Like, I 1,000 times a day I might say something about, white men, white cis man, da 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 da, right? Like, there's a way in which that feels very available and easy, because it's like, oh, they don't have anything to worry about, right? And so if you have that mentality about Jews, there's a kind of carelessness that you could easily bring into a relationship, right? Because you don't have that, because you don't understand anti-Semitism, basically, and it's yeah.
And that's why we're having this conversation,
Sure is.
Trying to get a deeper, more nuanced perspective, certainly at a time when nuance is lost, and in particularly on social media, where there's intentionally no space or room for nuance, and that is a very profound place where we see these conflations between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I just want to say I appreciate both of your thoughtful and reflective analyses, and it's quite thought-provoking so far for me at this point. Hopefully it is for you as well. You've also alluded to, and I want to ask specifically about this, when we see this conflation, and with this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, we often see the devaluing of very real anti-Semitism that exists, especially in the very violent forms of anti-Semitism, such as the targeting of synagogues. You mentioned the Tree of Life massacre, and the other violent forms and dangerous forms of anti-Semitism by radical white supremacists. I wonder, how can we combat this? How can we confront this? What are the various ways we can do that, and what's our role when we actually see anti-Semitism?
Wait, repeat it one more time.
Yeah, with the conflation, we see a devaluing of anti-Semitism when it's very, very real in our world, and in particular, violent forms of anti-Semitism. How can we combat the very real forms of anti-Semitism when they emerge? And relationship building is one of those key things. You have mentioned that. We all live in a world where we see the very intense and frightening forms of violent anti-Semitism. How can we confront that? In particular, today, April 2024, in the world we're living in.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the anti-Semitism that I'm always going to be most afraid of is white supremacist anti-Semitism. And I think that I do see in this political moment a rise in anti-Semitism due to the fact that there is this conflation, which is saying that all Jews must be Zionists, and therefore all Jews must support what is happening in Gaza. And what is happening in Gaza is absolutely horrific. And so if anyone can support that, they are like the lowest of low and worthy of being targeted. And therefore there's this kind of feedback loop of, therefore, Jews. Yeah, and I think it emboldens white supremacists in this time. There's kind of this kind of turning tide against the state of Israel that's getting conflated with a turning tide against the Jewish people as a whole, which then emboldens white supremacists. Like, it just makes it a much more acceptable thing to just like say violent things about Jews publicly, just in the same way that Trump getting elected made it much more acceptable to say violent things about Jews publicly. And we're a little lucky because like it is considered a bad thing to say violent things about Jews publicly, whereas it's often not considered a bad thing to say violent things about Muslims publicly or Black people publicly. And even just seeing, I don't know, in San Francisco, when a Jewish ice cream shop was targeted with anti-Semitic graffiti, it got like a huge like story in the New York Times. It's unacceptable to be anti-Semitic, and if someone acts in an anti-Semitic way, which they did in graffitiing that ice cream shop, but it gets a profile in the New York Times. I'm pretty sure it was. And when Palestinian restaurants, which many, many, many of them have been targeted with anti-Muslim and anti-Arab graffiti in this time, like you barely see a passing note of it in any newspaper. And so I think that, I don't really know. I think what I'm thinking about a lot in this time is how to keep my community specifically safe, and how to do so without buying into systems of security and safety that a lot of Jewish communities buy into, that rely really heavily on policing methods that target communities of color. And I think it's crucial that we actually build safety plans for our community right now, because there have been little anti-Semitic things that have happened toward or Shalom very directly related to what's happening right now. And so it's crucial that we have a safety plan. And it's I don't want that safety plan to just like be bars on the windows and cameras everywhere. And I think one thing we're talking about is like, how can we build relationships with other faith groups in our neighborhood, and how can we protect each other rather than relying on systems that kind of like secure our borders against our neighbors and things of the sort.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with everything you said, and it makes me think about just the one quick thing I would add is that, or two things, I guess. One is just to say that this may be a minor point that isn't critical in this context, but just that all anti-Jewish sentiment is an anti-Semitism. And I think there is some distinction to draw there. Maybe it's getting a little academic, but I think in the long run it does make a difference, that there's a difference between anti-Semitism, which is essentially a coherent conspiracy, internally coherent conspiracy theory, that's specifically targeting Jews, versus any other kind of anti-Jewish sentiment or sort of xenophobic, dislike of the other, which could be Jews, and then putting that aside, the other point just being like, one thing I think people are consistently confused by is how to make sense of anti-Jewish acts committed by people of color. Certainly in New York City, this is a big dynamic because a lot of the incidents have been that way. And what I always talk about is like, well, first of all, like that's most of New York City. It's mostly people of color, and then living right on top of each other and living right on top of Jews. So if there's going to be if there's going to be conflict, why would it be surprising that that's what it would look like? But the other thing to say is that, and part of why I was drawing that distinction before, is that the ideology of anti-Semitism is all around us, right? It is embedded in our culture because we have had 2,000 years of Christian hegemony, or we have all of these notions of all of the anti-Jewish stereotypes, all of the tropes, all of the things that people believe about Jews. These things have seeped into our culture and saturated it. it should not actually be surprising that we see anti-Jewish sentiment or anti-Semitic acts come from anywhere, right? This is why the whole thing about the left and the right, I can't believe there's anti-Semitism. Of course there's anti-Semitism on the left. There's anti-Semitism everywhere, because in exactly the same way, why would you be surprised to see sexism on the left? Why would you be surprised to see racism on the left? I certainly wouldn't be, right? Like, you can find these things everywhere. We just have to have a really sharp distinction about why people are doing them. And what's so dangerous about the moment that we're in, where you have both an organized white nationalist, white Christian nationalist right in the United States, and the horrific violence that's happening in Gaza, and all of this at the same time, is that like these ideas are out there and they're getting churned up, and that becomes like grist for all kinds of people who have, you know, some reason to have some anger that they want to express or whatever. Like it's gonna be it's not a great safe time to be Jewish. And yeah, there's more I could say about safety, but I don't want to go on. So yeah.
I want to ask maybe one or two more questions before we dive into these, which are quite compelling. You mentioned graffiti, so want to talk about that. So when people do write graffiti in solidarity with Palestinians on buildings that are distinctly identified with Jews, either Jewish businesses or synagogues or Jewish institutions, what can we do to challenge this type of targeting, this type of anti-Semitism inside the Palestine solidarity movement? And whose responsibility is it to make these challenges?
So a lot of the work that we do on hate violence, one of the things that I'm very proud of that JFREJ has done is in 2019, after there was that huge rise in anti-Semitic hate violence that was then shortly, unfortunately, followed by the huge rise in anti-Asian hate violence, certainly in New York City and I think nationally. We started a new coalition called NYC Against Hate, which, by the way, I'll just say, none of us really like the hate language. There's a lot that's problematic about it, but it's like the only thing that anybody understands, so we use it. I'm happy to talk to anybody who wants to about what's problematic about it at some point. But, and we started this coalition that was like Asian communities, Jewish communities, LGBTQ New Yorkers, immigrant New Yorkers, Latinx folks, Muslim, Arab, South Asian, like all of these different organizations all coming together to work on preventing hate violence without resorting to more investment in policing and the carceral state. Like the notion being that, number one, that is a failed program, and the other thing being that like it is very obvious to all of us that the only way that that gets changed is in communities. Like it's by having communities building partnerships and working together and sticking up for each other that we are going to like change what goes on in our communities, not by like having some cop sitting in his car on a corner somewhere. As part of that work, you know, like it's really interesting. The huge proportion of that rise in hate violence is graffiti. Like, actually, what's funny is when you take that out, the numbers are really small. That doesn't mean it's not there, and I think it matters. I actually think the graffiti matters a lot. Like, I actually don't think it's irrelevant or a joke. But what it highlights is, like, number one, just like what kind of threat, right? I think part of the thing that we have to do as Jews is take a deep breath and ground ourselves in like what threat are we actually facing? Because there are real dangers for Jews. We know that, right? It's absolutely true that there are real dangers. And it's very possible that somebody tagging something on a mailbox is not one of them. It might be, but it might not be. So I think that's like one of the questions as a community. I think we owe it to ourselves, at least for our own blood pressure, to ask. The thing that spurred us to action to start this coalition was when a 14-year-old kid was arrested by the NYPD for tagging a swastika, I think on a playground, I think possibly in chalk. I might be confusing a couple of incidents, but like, and they tweeted about it triumphantly. Like, we are protecting the Jewish community. We have arrested a 14-year-old, and we're just like, that is not There's no way that has made anyone safer, right? And the notion that comes from some deep-seated anti-Semitic ideology, like it's a symbol that this kid learned somewhere that kids do stuff, right? Right now, there are a lot of people who are really, really angry about what's happening in Gaza, and I think they have that they're right to be. They certainly have a right to be. It's not weird that that's going to get expressed in strange ways. That doesn't make it okay, and we should all be really, really clear that it's not okay for someone to write like Free Palestine on a synagogue or something like that, no matter how much we might agree with the sentiment. But the reason it's not okay is because they're conflating Judaism with Zionism. Like, that's the irony. That's the thing. It goes all the way back. The very thing that the ADL wants to do, right? The very thing that some people want to do. That's what that is. So anyway.
Yeah. I was gonna say something similar. Of like, if someone graffitis Free Palestine on a synagogue, they just happen to be passing by a synagogue. They see that it's a synagogue, and they're like, "I'm gonna write Free Palestine." Like, yes, that is anti-Semitic, not maybe in the kind of like ideological sense, but in the kind of remnants of sense that we've been discussing, and yet what I've been thinking about a lot is like there's a lot of evidence out there to support their supposition that this synagogue is in support of the bombing campaign in Gaza and in the ground, everything happening in Gaza right now, the lack of aid, the lack of food, the lack of resources. And therefore, they're like making a judgment call based on the information in front of them, which is that the majority of Jewish organizations, including the majority of synagogues in the U.S., have not come out in support of a ceasefire, which means that if they tag a synagogue, more likely than not, they are correct that synagogue might have a political ideology that is in opposition to what they are tagging. Is it productive? I don't think so. I mean, it's an outlet for anger. And I think I see part of our responsibility, therefore, as Jews and as Jews who hold a certain politic and who don't support what's happening, to therefore provide counter evidence to the evidence that is going to show that, that all Jews support what is happening. And that is absolutely terrifying, especially when you are the minority. So I think, like, for example, Or Shalom, we just bought a building for the first time in our history. We were about to put up at least a temporary sign saying, like, we are Or Shalom. And then October 7th happened, and I've kind of been like, let's not put up a sign. Like, I just don't want people knowing we're here. And I think that's for all sorts of reasons. And maybe it's, and I think I might be letting my fear get the best of me. But I think that, we did for a moment, because we were going through a process around zoning with the city, have some papers up on the synagogue that said, we're trying to switch the zoning of this building so that the synagogue can be here. We had to legally put up a notice to the community so that anyone could attend the zoning hearing if they wanted to. We were running an event inside, and we're on a main street. And one of my congregants walked out to her car to get something and saw someone kind of staring at the sign, and that person turned to her. It was an older white lady. And was like, I wish it wasn't a Jewish organization moving into the neighborhood. I wish it was a Palestinian one. And, that's not anti-Semitism, but that, or maybe it is, but it certainly hurts, and it certainly feels inappropriate, because I'm like, oh, well, you don't know who we are. You don't know what we stand for. You're assuming, it kind of draws this dichotomy of like Palestinian good, Jewish bad. And that's not the binary, and that's not the dichotomy I want to be drawing. I want to say, like, people who are for collective liberation, including the liberation of Palestinian and Jewish peoples, are on one side, and the people who see their liberation at the expense of other people on the other side. And
the Palestinians could be really into like Kenny G and blast it all day and night. You don't know who.
Yeah. So I think that, right. I don't know.
I appreciate that point about collective liberation, because that brings us back to the start in terms of your focus on relationship building and building alliances across differences, and safety and security for all being a really, really essential part of this conversation. What we see both on the ground in Israel, Palestine, but also here in the United States, that the security of all really is intertwined, and we cannot have security for one, as you said, predicated on the oppression or lack of security, insecurity for others. I want to jump to some of these questions.
Before you jump to the question, can I just say a very quick thing, just in response? There's 10/7 was like the Hamas violence was horrific, and everything that's happened since then is horrific. And the one, like, if there's one little silver lining somewhere, I'm sure there is more than one, but one of them certainly is, like, I think that there was a period of time when a lot of certainly white Ashkenazi American Jews thought that they were on a path, maybe implicitly or explicitly, to having like a depoliticized, like deracinated, depoliticized identity. And like that is not available to so many other people, right? Like if you are a person of color, if you are queer, if you are many other things, if you are, anyway, like there is a chance, just what you were saying about safety, right? Just that there's like a chance here to like re-find something like that. It's scary, it's terrifying to be politicized by virtue of who you are wherever you go. And there's a kind of visibility and a fear in that visibility, but like, welcome to the party, like this is, like it's okay. Like you've got a lot of comrades. If you're willing to look right at that, you've got lots and lots of people who are going through the same thing. And if you see those people as your allies, then you've got like a huge community who wants to struggle in it with you. It's just if you were thinking that maybe you could beat it, if you could like sneak out, then sorry to.
No, I really appreciate that. Join the party. It's a party. This is. I wanted to say that we're really just opening up a conversation here. It is impossible in an hour and 90 minutes to complete this conversation. So please know we're not going to get to all of these. I will offer you up as being here after 8 o'clock to hang out for a couple more minutes if people want to ask the questions that are not asked here. I want to make sure to get to these first two, which are corollaries in a sense. I'm going to start with the first and we'll move from there. So this question says that Zionism in Israel gives Jews a safe place. If Jews feel safer living in Israel, where they are constantly attacked, what does that say about Jews all over the world?
Can you read it one more time?
Zionism in Israel gives Jews a safe place. So the premise is that if Jews feel safer in Israel, where they are constantly attacked, what does that say about Jews all over the world?
Great. Okay, fair. So I think the reasons that people, live somewhere or choose to live somewhere are much, much bigger than safety. And in fact, people will tolerate an enormous amount of unsafety to live in communities with the people that they love, with people who care about them, and that have other kinds of spiritual meaning or historical meaning, right? This goes directly to this point about compassion, right? If you just hate all Israelis and you think that they're all bad, you are ignoring every Israeli baby. You're ignoring every small child who just grew up, didn't emigrate there, is not a settler or colonist, is someone who just grew up there the way that all of us grow up in the place that we grow up with and form roots and connections to a place. The exact same thing is true of Palestinians, obviously. And certainly the way that I know this is I think about all of the black people in the Americans, you had millions of black people who migrated, hundreds of thousands of black people who migrated to the north in in waves of migration to escape the terrorist violence of the Klan, and you had millions of people who stayed because that was their home and they weren't going to be driven off or driven out, right? So I mean, I think more than anything, we just have to complicate that narrative and then deal with what that means, right? Like that doesn't therefore lead to some obvious political formula. It's just what's true about humans, including Jews.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. I think that I certainly see the foundation of the state of Israel was entirely about safety. It was founded by mostly European Jews experiencing immense anti-Semitism, and not like, not anti-Semitic tropes like we're talking about, like mass violence that like all the way up to genocide. And I think that I found years ago, there are these things called memory books and they're about different towns all over Eastern Europe, and it's survivors of those towns writing the narratives of like what Jewish life was like in those towns before they were decimated by the Holocaust. And found one for the town in Poland that part of my mom's family is from, and part of it is it's talking about all the different Zionist youth movements that were operating in the town, because Zionism in its origin was a diverse movement with a lot of different political ideologies. There were many different versions of Zionism. Some were socialist, and some were hyper militaristic, and some were cultural but not political, and there were so many different versions of Zionism. And what I discovered from this memory book is my ancestors were in the most militaristic right-wing Zionist youth group that you could be involved in. And what a lot of these youth groups were doing in these towns were practicing for what it would be like to move to the land and be farmers, and either practicing military tactics or practicing kind of what their land-based practices would be. But they were rehearsing and practicing. And they were doing so because where they were living was wildly unsafe, and this was seen as the only safe solution at that time. It was that, or it was going to America, the promised land, which we also know is incredibly problematic. And my branch of the family went to America, but the other branch of the family either died or went to Israel. And I definitely think the founding of the state was for the sake of Jewish safety, and those founding it were so traumatized that it did not matter to them the cost of that safety. That safety was the most important thing, and no one had ever looked out for them, so why should they have to look out for anyone else? And that's not true of all Zionists. There were plenty who were asking the Arab question and trying to figure out what they should do about the Palestinians who were living there. And at the time, it was one of the safest solutions for Jews in Europe was this emigration to Palestine. And I think the narrative now that Israel keeps the Jews safe is so far from my reality of Israel. And I think I really resonate with what you're saying. I've lived in Israel. I usually live right along the Green Line, which is where I like to live, which is a line primarily through Jerusalem, that kind of straddles the line between where Palestinians live and where Jews live. And that is kind of where I like to situate myself when I'm there, because it's where I feel most at home. And I think that I don't feel safe in Israel. There's people walking around with giant machine guns all around you all the time. And sure, I might not be their targets, but sometimes I would go and try to block a home demolition, and then I certainly am their target. And nothing about it makes me feel safe. Do I feel a sense of belonging when everyone's going to Shabbos services? Absolutely. And is it profound and beautiful? Absolutely. Would I like to be able to have that feeling without needing to be armed to the nth degree? Absolutely. I think that there's so much beauty in what it is, but the reality of it is it's at expense of other people being able to live their cultural pathways, and it is also yeah, I feel like it's the most unsafe place for Jews to live at this moment in time, actually. And I don't think Jews are safe anywhere right now, but I certainly don't see Israel as a place where Jews are safe right now.
We have 5 minutes left, and that leads very nicely into, I think, what will be our final question. We are sitting at a Jesuit university, and there's a question about how can Christian communities engage with anti-Zionism, and how can they seek Palestinian liberation without harming Jewish communities? 5 minutes.
That's a great question. I mean, listen, I think everyone, speaking for myself, I think if you are against mass death, then everyone should be out there fighting for a ceasefire immediately. And if you want that lack of mass death to go on into the future, then you should be thinking and fighting for the liberation and a political future for Palestinians with self-determination, as well as safety for Jews in Israel and everywhere else. I think the most valuable thing Christians can do is call out other Christians. I mean, in the United States, in this context, by far the most powerful political, I mean, something that many people don't know, I'm sure everyone in this room knows it, but that so many people don't realize that, that Kufi and the other Christian Zionist organizations dwarf AIPAC and the Jewish organizations. They are so much bigger, by many, many factors, right? There are way more Christians fighting for, sending money to Israel and fighting for arms sales to Israel and all those things than there are Jews in the United States. That is the work of Christians to do. Go get them. They're not hard to find. So that's my first answer.
I don't know what to say. I think it's interesting. I think that there is a performative nature that can occur in any leftist community, including the anti-Zionist community. And I think part of the performance right now within anti-Zionism is, and especially at this moment I've seen, is because the violence at this moment, and honestly over the past 75 years, has been so imbalanced. There's been violence against everyone, but the violence has been incredibly imbalanced, and with Palestinians at the bottom of that power imbalance, that therefore there's this way in which that if you're a proper leftist, you're 100% with Palestinians, and as you were saying earlier, basically ignoring the humanity of Israelis. And I think, I don't know, for me sometimes it's one thing if my fellow Jews are doing that, but when I see white Christians specifically doing that, it's really frustrating. And I've organized with a lot of white Christians. I worked for, as I said, Sabeel and Friends of Sabeel North America. I've worked with a lot of Christians who are doing work to support Palestine. And I think that they need to be all the more careful to guard against anti-Semitism and to guard against dehumanizing Jews and dehumanizing Israelis than the rest. I think everyone needs to guard against it, but there's something about being in the privileged position of being a white Christian in this country that you need to ensure that your support of any marginalized people is not at the expense of any other marginalized people. And that, so I think, I don't know.
That is a beautiful and profound place to end. And I want to say again, Leo and Rabbi Faryn, thank you so much for this brave, important, poignant, and powerful conversation. Again, we are just opening up the doors here for greater conversations. And thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful evening.